Hello and welcome back. I'm glad you're listening. This is podcast number 22 in my podcast series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. In this podcast, we're going to be comparing Spanish and English colonies. One noted scholar described Spain's empire in America as an empire of conquest, while he also described Britain's American empire as an empire of commerce. Spain and England were very different nations, and the way that they went about establishing and operating their colonies was very different. These differences are still resonating among the nations of North and South America to this day. The Spanish came as conquerors. We've all heard of the conquistadors, while the English described their colonies as plantations, meaning plantations of people. Conqueror versus planter. That alone is a huge contrast in self-perception. Spain conquered vast amounts of land, while the English tended to focus on their seagoing commercial enterprises. To start with, I think it would be a good idea to briefly describe what was going on in England and Spain at the time they began their colonizing efforts. It explains so much about how their colonies were operated. England was convulsed with internal conflicts, including a bloody civil war. There was intensive debate in England about constitutional issues such as the relationship between king and parliament and the rights of Englishmen. At the very same time, the Protestant Reformation racked England with another kind of internal turmoil. The religious and political strife were interconnected. Widespread reading of the Bible caused many Englishmen to search for more doctrinally pure forms of worship and belief. Spain's history was very different. In 711 AD, Muslims from North Africa, called Moors, sometimes called Saracens, invaded Spain and conquered large portions of it. The Spanish spent the next 7 centuries in endless holy crusades attempting to expel the Moors. This gave Spanish society a militaristic outlook fired by religious zeal. There was no Protestant Reformation in Spain. Catholicism was the only religion allowed. Spain also drew from older Roman traditions. The Spanish government tightly regulated who was able to enter its colonies. Jews, gypsies, Muslims, and heretics were not allowed to enter Spain's colonies. In sharp contrast, England's kings saw the colonies as a relief valve, a place where undesirables could be sent, and also a place where political opponents such as Puritans could go. There was also a massive influx of Protestants from other European nations, especially Germany, flooding into the English colonies. In fact, in England, there were people writing tracts promoting the colonies as paradises and places where people could flourish. No such genre of literature existed in Spain. There were no promoters there. Spanish kings tightly regulated and controlled their colonies, while England's kings did exactly the opposite. The highest-ranking officials in the Spanish colonies were the viceroys. They answered directly to the king. Below them were governors that governed specific territories. Spanish colonies tended to be built around towns and cities. Towns didn't really produce anything, but they were a place where Spanish authority could emanate from and control the countryside. Spanish officials had more authority and power to do what they wanted to do in Spanish colonies, but they were also more tightly regulated and subject to intensive scrutiny by the Spanish king. English governors, on the other hand, were not subject to much scrutiny. As I mentioned earlier, English kings, especially in the early period, didn't care much about the colonies. But on the other hand, English governors had very little power to do what they wanted to do because each English colony had an assembly, which over time assumed more and more power, especially over finances. Spanish governors were also supported by church courts. Nothing like this existed in the English colonies. Spanish colonists had no real voice in government unless they wanted to opt for rioting and armed rebellion. Perhaps one of the biggest differences between the English and Spanish colonies were that the English colonies had elected assemblies patterned after Parliament in England. England had a long history and tradition of limiting the king's power, beginning with the Magna Carta, and English colonists demanded that their rights be protected. Spanish colonists had no such thing in their colonies. There were no elected assemblies. There was no tradition of limiting of crown power, which meant there was really no mechanism for peacefully correcting problems or redressing grievances. Occasionally in the Spanish colonies, a strong man might appear who had enough resources and perhaps charisma and followers and high enough social standing that he could actually question or challenge crown authority. Such rebellions, though, were dangerous, and very often the Spanish king was very brutal in how he put down such revolts. Spain's colonies eventually did get independence from Spain, but the process of independence was much more painful. The Spanish colonies were subject to more terror and devastation than the English colonies were when they got their independence in 1776. Both the English and the Spanish saw their colonizing efforts in religious terms. One Puritan minister in Massachusetts named Cotton Mather had this to say in 1702, "The overruling providence of the great God is to be acknowledged as well in the concealing of America for so long a time as in the discovering of it when the fullness of time was come for the discovery." Puritans saw America as a place where they could set up a city on a hill, an example for the rest of the world of how Christianity ought to be done, and as a safe refuge and haven from the destruction that was surely coming upon wicked Europe. Spanish Catholic clergymen also saw America in religious terms as a place where the Word of God could be spread in preparation for the second coming of Christ. It's important to remember that Spain's colonizing efforts began before the Reformation, while England's colonizing efforts began after the Protestant Reformation had begun. Spain and its colonies had only one religion, that was the Roman Catholic Church, while England's colonies ended up as battlegrounds for competing Protestant denominations. As a result, there was more religious freedom in England's colonies. Another important difference was the use of the Bible. For Protestants, the Bible was the ultimate source of authority for how they should conduct themselves and for doctrinal beliefs. Roman Catholics, higher clergy, especially the Pope, were the source of doctrine and beliefs. In the English colony, the Bible was widely read, and most families had a copy somewhere in their home. It was also used in schools for teaching children to read. It's very interesting how the English and Spanish both went about naming their towns. It says a lot about the mindset of the two different nations. Throughout the Spanish Empire, you find lots of names of towns and even regions that have spiritual, biblical, or religious meaning or terms in them. You almost never find this in the English Empire. One example is the city of Los Angeles in California. Originally, it was called El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de los Ángeles. In English, that roughly translates to the town or settlement of Our Lady, the Queen of the Angels. Today, we just shortened it to Los Angeles. Both the Spanish and the English saw the Indians as degenerates in need of Christianizing. Both the Spanish and English speculated about the origins of the Indians and how they fit into the biblical account of world history. Some speculated that the Indians were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, but here the similarities end. The Spanish sought not only to conquer the Indians, but to absorb and assimilate them into Spanish culture. Essentially, they turned the Indians into slaves. Because Spanish colonists were almost always male, at least in the early days of the empire, they were encouraged to marry Indian women, which created a complex situation in a society that was hierarchical. If you came directly from Spain, you were at the top of the heap. If you were born in the colonies and you were of Spanish descent, you were probably next in line in this hierarchy. If you were of mixed Spanish and Indian descent, you would probably fall somewhere third in this hierarchy, and at the bottom were the Indians and the black slaves. English society also had a certain amount of hierarchy to it, but it was not nearly so rigid or as complicated, and generally, if you could make money, you could move into the highest social standing within your community in the English colonies. In order to convert the Indians, the Spanish sent out priests out into the wilderness to set up missions. The object of the mission was not only to convert the Indians, but to also properly make them into Spanish citizens. Once the Indians had been converted to Catholicism and become proper Spanish citizens, the missions could then turn into a nucleus for settlement and further town building that then could project Spanish power into the countryside. The idea being that Spain could then grow its empire, both the faith and the culture of Spain. Probably the most famous missions are the ones that dot the California coast. The English generally didn't have any interest in conquering the Indians so much as they wanted to trade with them and just remain separate from them. There were some missionary efforts done by the English to convert the Indians, but these weren't nearly as intensive and usually weren't forceful either like they were among the Spanish. The English also did traffic in some Indian slavery, but it wasn't nearly as much, I think, as what the Spanish did. I talk more about this in detail in my podcast about South Carolina. Spain discovered enormous precious metal wealth in the New World. With an Indian slave labor force, they were able to extract untold sums of gold and silver. Between 1492 and 1600, 2 billion pesos worth of gold and silver, approximately, were shipped to Spain from her colonies. This intensive mining activity set the tone for Spain's economic policy, which focused on mining and precious metal production. Spain exercised a tight regulatory hand on the economic activity of its colonies, which, when combined with the undue emphasis placed on mining, stunted the economic growth of Spain's colonies in many ways. England's first colonists in Virginia also attempted to find gold and silver. They figured that since the Spanish had found so much, they would certainly find some as well, but they didn't. Within a short time, they were making more money raising tobacco. Had England's colonists found gold and silver, I'm not sure that their colony's economic development would have been as prosperous as it had. It's one of those interesting historical speculations to wonder what would have happened had England found gold and silver in New England or somewhere along the Atlantic coast of the United States. England's government might have become as regulatory and harsh as Spain's government was in producing and emphasizing only the production of precious metals while excluding other valuable industries. On the whole, the English colonists tended to have more prosperity and more opportunity for prosperity than did their Spanish counterparts in the Spanish colonies. For further reading on this topic, I recommend the following books. The Epic of Latin America by John Crow. Empires of the Atlantic World, Britain and Spain and America, 1492 to 1830, by J.H. Eliot. Lords of All the World. Ideologies of Empire in Spain, Britain, and France, 1500 to 1800, by Anthony Pagden. And History of the Americas by John Francis Bannon.